Good afternoon, and welcome to Southern College of Optometry's August webinar on interviewing skills. I hope that all of you are continuing to stay safe and healthy. And I see some very familiar names, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us again for another webinar. And I also know that some of you have already begun your fall semester, so I hope all is going well. My name is Ashley Cates, and I am the Student Services and Admissions Officer at Southern College of Optometry. I've probably spoken to a few of you already, but I am one of the admissions team members who answers your admissions inquiries, arranges campus tours, and participates in the admissions interview process. Joining me today is Mr. Joe Hauser, Vice President of Student Services at SEO. He has over 25 years of experience in student services, admissions, and recruiting, including roles as Dean of Students and Director of Records and Admission. And he knows all there is to know in regards to the admissions interviewing process. He is very involved throughout the admissions process and facilitates many of the counseling sessions with candidates. So needless to say, Mr. Hauser is extremely knowledgeable about interviewing during the application process, and he will undoubtedly be able to offer a wealth of good information. So I appreciate Mr. Hauser's taking the time to join us today to provide his invaluable insights on interviewing strategies. As we go through the session, I encourage you to ask questions as you think of them and post them in the question box. We may address them while in progress of the session or save them until the end, but we will be sure to address your inquiries. Furthermore, I want you to be aware that the webinar is being recorded. And once it's downloaded, we will make it available for you to view again via YouTube if you choose. Many of you are planning or have applied already to optometry school during this cycle. The purpose of this webinar is to assist you in getting better prepared for your potential interviews. We know that many of you have questions and concerns regarding the interview process. So today, we would like to offer you tips and strategies for navigating the interview process during this unprecedented time, and also enhancing your strengths as an applicant. So without further delay, I would like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Hauser.
Thank you, Ashley, for those kind words. With that intro, I hope I can deliver. But for everybody involved, before I get any further, one of the things I like to do with any webinar session, but certainly with interview topic, is to hopefully provide you information that not only helps prepare for an SEO interview, but if you're applying and interviewing at multiple schools, I'd like to think that the information I'm providing you would be germane to several, or if not all, of the optometry schools. So at least that's a goal of mine. It's not just the SEO aspect, but overall interview skills, but certainly as it's applicable, what we're looking for as an SEO admissions office. I'll also forewarn, my lovely 40-pound mutt is next to me, and if a leaf falls, she might bark. So if you hear some barking in the background, it's not necessarily my other voice. But no, without further ado, let's get started. So on this first slide, as far as the essential or the big three, really an interview, if you boil it down to it from a school standpoint, and certainly SEOs, is trying to get to know you better, and are you a good match for us, and are we a good match for you? So when we say what is your experience, that can be interpreted in many different ways, but we definitely are interested in your optometric experience and your reasons for choosing optometry. Are they sound decisions? Or have you not really done your homework, and therefore we're not quite sure if a candidate is ready for that next step? So doing your homework and being able to demonstrate experience in the field is very critical in the interview. Do you have the discipline to succeed? And that also can take many different levels. We'll start academically. What sounds more impressive? If a student is sharing their academic experience and they say, well, my hardest semester, I took 18 hours, worked 20 hours a week, shadowed an optometrist, and was president of my pre-optometry club, versus I took 12 hours and went straight to my dorm and played PS4. The discipline aspect, you could also interject time management is very impressive and important. So when we say the discipline to succeed, a lot of it has to do with your past experiences academically and within the field. Have you been able to demonstrate that you can juggle your time and set your mind to a goal and complete that goal? And basically, the third point about future state of healthcare, as well as certainly optometry, do you know what you're getting into as far as when you are a healthcare provider, you are dealing with billing and coding and insurance. Certainly, if you're dealing with sometimes you have to deliver bad news to a patient. In an optometrist's case, maybe the patient is going blind, and there are some cases that can be terminal. And we just want to make sure that you're aware of and done your homework so that you know about the profession and healthcare as well, not just being a good student. So those are basically the big three. Okay, about being experienced, work and shadowing that you have done. One of the common questions we get is it better to work for an optometrist or shadow different optometrists? And both are very positive. When you're working for an optometrist or a group, you get a little more in-depth and probably more interactive with patients, which is great. The advantage of shadowing is that you can contact different offices and get exposure to different offices easier. If you're working for an optometrist, it's probably you go into more depth, but your experience is with basically just that one practice. Shadowing, it allows you to see different, you can see a solo practitioner, a group practice, a primary care family optometry, specializations like vision therapy, low vision, ocular disease, sports vision, etc. So both are very important, and either are required, in my opinion, to be a strong candidate. If you can get both, that is great. So a lot of times questions will come up when you tell your interviewer what kind of work or shadowing you've had to date. A question like, what kind of impression did it make upon you? What did shadowing or working reinforce your reasons for pursuing optometry, and why? About the scope of the profession, this is a really evolving aspect because different states, you may know this already, allow you to do different things. Like in Louisiana and Kentucky, for example, certain surgical procedures are allowed. In Massachusetts, you can't treat for glaucoma. So knowing the state laws, and your home state is important, but at SCO, we're going to teach you to the highest level. Like in Tennessee, laser privileges are not yet there, but we have the ability to teach laser privileges, and we have a surgical theater in our clinic. So knowing the scope, because if your state doesn't have it now, it may in 5 to 10 years, so that when you're a practicing optometrist, you may have surgical components to your license that right now isn't there. So knowing that in advance is always impressive on an interview. And then about special interests, one of the beauties of the optometry license and optometry degree, let's say compared to medicine, is with medicine, you get your 4-year degree, then you do your residency, and your license, like if you're an OBGYN or if you're a pediatrician, is narrowed to that very particular field. With optometry, your license allows you to see family, you can be as general as possible, like family care, or you can be as specific. You can see, I see nothing but pediatrics patients. I see nothing but vision therapy patients. So that flexibility is nice, but many times in an interview, you want to be able to portray that you are aware of those aspects with your interviewer. Having the willpower and discipline, probably the biggest difference with optometry school, when sometimes we'll say, how tough are the classes? And by and large, it's not that any one class is significantly more difficult than, let's say, the toughest class you've had in undergrad, but imagine having 6 or 7 of them is probably more applicable than certain classes in optometry school are 50 times more difficult than undergrad. It's the volume and the ability to manage your time. So we also realize that when you're taking 23, 22, 23, 24 hours of nothing but lab sciences for the first 2 years. So it's a higher volume than probably what you had in undergrad. So it's interesting in the interview to see how have you been able to balance life and school or pressure or stress. Like, for example, are you working? Do you exercise? What do you like to do in your downtime? Because it is important, no matter how challenging optometry school is, to have those outlets, whether it's working out or hanging out with friends or traveling. Of course, maybe not right now with COVID, or hanging out with friends with COVID, but the ability to have those stress releases is very important, so that you don't want to burn out. And keep in mind, SEO has a 99% graduation rate. So we've been very successful in not only admitting students who have the academic acumen to make it through optometry school, but have had a proper life school balance. The adaptability in dealing with change. One of the biggest changes in optometry school versus undergrad is it's a lot more critical thinking. In undergrad, especially if you're a biology major, you may have had a lot of classes that, quite candidly, may have been memorization, and then you spit it out on a test. And that's going to be in optometry school as well. But there's a lot more critical thinking, and that can be a challenge for some. If you haven't had many life experiences or class experiences with deductive reasoning, etc., that can be frustrating. And at SEO, I think we do a great job of teaching first years who haven't had that kind of exposure that you might fail at some things. There's no adage you have to crack a few eggs to bake a cake. And so, but you have to be aware that you might fail at some things at first. Like, there's a lab procedure. You may not get it, you probably won't get it right that first time. But if you've been a straight A student all your life, that can be frustrating. There's nothing wrong with it, but you want to be self-aware. And so sometimes the questions will come up about adaptability, because that would lend the faculty interviewer to believe that you do have that flexibility, which would be a healthy student. And again, the same thing about ability and willingness to sacrifice. It's not so much, it's more about time, about if this is what you want to do as a career for the next 4 years, are you willing to sacrifice maybe a little more time than maybe what your friends and family would have? Because not everyone can become a doctor. And therefore, it is a little harder. And if it wasn't harder and anyone could do it, it wouldn't be as rewarding. So those are some things to keep in mind that some of the questions on the interviews might be trying to extract. Okay, doing your homework. I love this slide. I've often said, and this may come up later, when I'm a backup interviewer, and when I do an interview, I'm usually more impressed by the questions the applicant may have of me than just not only answering my questions. So doing your homework about optometry and SEO really can set yourself apart than other applicants. Do you understand the commitment involved? So if I'm interviewing an applicant, they basically imply, oh, what I did in undergrad is probably going to work for optometry school. Probably not. That may tell me maybe he or she hasn't or doesn't understand that it's not taking 14, 15 hours in undergrad. It's taking 23, 24 hours of arguably harder work. Do you have realistic opinions regarding healthcare optometry? So, if someone interviews and says, yeah, I think I can make $1 million a year and work 20 hours a week, that's an unrealistic expectation. Or I don't like dealing with patients, or I don't like dealing with people going through tough times. Well, being a healthcare provider, patients are coming to you with primarily their visual problems, but it can be stressful for them. So you, excuse me, you have to be aware that if a 65-year-old grandmother is where it has, let's say, macular degeneration, and it's concerned that it might be turning wet and she may be going blind, she might have a high stress level about that. And you just have to be aware of handling that aspect, not just her visual aspect. And like I said, a working knowledge of the healthcare systems, because optometrists will co-manage. A lot of optometry patients are diabetic. In fact, you may know this, but for type 2 diabetes is more often diagnosed by an optometrist than an MD. Because when you're looking at the back of the eye in an eye exam, you can see the blood vessels and be able to detect if a patient were diabetic. So if a patient were diabetic, you'll be co-managing that patient with their GP or sometimes an ophthalmologist if surgery. So you have to be also aware that that's a component of healthcare delivery. Okay, so the admissions process. So when you apply the OptomCast, as you probably all know, is all 23 optometry schools use OptomCast. And most schools, including SEO, have a supplemental application. So you submit your application along with supporting documentation. We receive it, process it, and evaluate particularly your transcripts to see if you are academically qualified. Those of us in our office will do an initial review to determine, is this person ready or eligible or competitive for an admissions interview? We don't interview everybody. At SEO, we usually interview about 30. Well, we invite about 35, about a third of the applicant pool, and we'll interview about 30% of the applicant pool. So once a student is invited for an interview, they'll be getting an email from the admissions office about that and set up a day and time to conduct that, and then we have the actual interview itself. And then shortly thereafter, usually within a few days, we will meet as a committee to review the applicant file and render a decision. And I'll go ahead and say this as well. We also, because I'm the one that leads this too, we'll do a scholarship review as well as admissions. So therefore, when we're reviewing your file for admission, we're also potentially reviewing your file for a potential scholarship. And just a graph of the cycle or the timetable. So when you're invited for the interview, you're first going to have a counseling session. I do some sessions, Ms. Kate does some sessions, as well as Ms. Sunny Ewing, Ms. Avery Cunningham, and Mr. Mike Robertson. The five of us divvy it up and conduct the counseling session. This is the open file part. We're going to go over your transcripts, your OAT scores, look at the courses you're taking and from what college, what is your major, your letters of recommendation, etc. Then after the counseling session, we'll set up the interview. Of course, this is all virtual now. And it's no pun intended, a blind interview. The interviewer will know nothing about you other than your name and home state and some basic information. We obviously do that intentionally. We do not want the interviewer to be too biased, positively or negatively, because we want them, if I can be sort of direct, if the interviewer knows nothing about you going into the interview, ask you open-ended questions, and you're able to sort of tell your story, we feel that's a sign of strong communication skills and sort of parallel to an optometrist walking into an exam room with a patient they've never seen before. Can they explain to Mrs. Jones what's going on with her eyes today and their vision, and what are you going to be doing to manage it? So that's the reason why we do a blind one-on-one interview. And because we don't want the interviewer to have any bias, you're not going to have their transcript say, oh, you made a C- in calculus your sophomore year. Let's talk about that. They will not have that information at their disposal. After the interviewer will submit his or her recommendation of the interview, and it will go to the committee for the committee to review all applicants who've interviewed and determine if an acceptance offer is warranted.
Mr. Hauser, we have a question about the
Yes.
blind interview. So a participant would like to know, does the faculty member get to look at their personal statements?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the second part with my barking dog? I'm sorry.
In the blind interview, does the faculty member get to look at the personal statement from the candidate?
Not before. Not before. We do allow the interviewing faculty member to look at the file, including the transcript after their submission, but we want the submission of the interview to be truly unbiased and naive.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess steps or things to have prepared before a virtual interview. Make sure your internet connection is reliable and steady. As far as practicing, like I've had 2 counseling sessions, and what I have found with virtual interviews versus in person, I notice eye contact a lot more because you're looking at a screen versus in person, you've got distractors at the room. And I was very pleased on the 2 interviews that I've had so far, counseling sessions, that my 2 candidates had really good eye contact. Because I noticed I was focusing on that a little bit more with a virtual. So just you can practice with a friend. We use Microsoft Teams. Zoom is very comparable, of course, but just practice it so it's not the first time that you do this on an interview by not just having a Teams or Zoom call, but having that person asking you questions. Choosing a quiet location. Ironically, with my dog right next to me, that's a little. I should practice what I preach, but that is very helpful with the interview as well. Demonstrate professionalism. Dress appropriately. Be ready and be also on time, so that there's nothing like a bad impression than showing up for the interview 5 to 10 minutes late. And then select questions that they will ask you and answer them. I use this analogy. Politicians are horrible at this. When an interviewer or a journalist asks a question, a politician will say a bunch of stuff and never really answer the direct question. That can be very frustrating to an interviewer. So make sure that when they ask you a question, be prepared to ask, but also have questions for them. That you may have 2 or 3 questions that you'd like to ask the interviewer about SEN. That's perfectly fine too. So being prepared. You want to be the best that you can be, because there are also adages, you only have 1 chance at a first impression. So some questions that you may often find or be prepared for is to talk a little bit about yourself. You may think, I don't want to sound cocky or egotistical or anything like that. No, they're not. They're wanting to know more about you to see if they've learned more about you. That again, test your communication skills. Why you want to be an optometrist, and there's so many different answers for that. There's not one good answer or a best answer for that. What would you do if you weren't going to optometry school? And that's not a trick question, but it's like, well, if you weren't doing optometry, what would be your next? Might tell a little bit about you, and the interviewer might discern. If they're not doing optometry, they're doing something else that's relevant, and therefore might imply that optometry might be a good match. And then some basically like anything that you'd like to add or share. If there's anything that the interviewer asks that doesn't incorporate things that you'd like to say, it gives you the chance to do that. And then if you have questions for them. So during the interview, connecting and communicating appropriately with your interviewer, it makes their job easier as they fill out the evaluation. So again, if you answer their questions fully and directly, that's a great starting point. Were you energetic? And I want to answer this one carefully. It's not whether or not you're introverted, extroverted, but if your body posture or just any kind of body language implies, oh, I really don't want to be here, maybe the interviewer interprets that as apathy, and you certainly don't want to elicit that. And when we say energetic and fun, it's not in a flippant way, but it's really more, did the conversation go well with ease? It's kind of like, maybe this is a bad analogy, but you go on a first date and you assess, oh, talking with him or her was so easy, is a good sign that the date went well. And in an interview, the best interviews, the interviewers will say, you know, halfway into it or shortly into it, I forgot I was interviewing the candidate. It seemed like much more of a conversation. So you just want to have a good exchange with the interviewer, like you're having just a regular discussion. The question about give them something to work with, don't make them press you for information. So like, for example, if a faculty member, if the interviewer says, what was your toughest class in undergrad? And you don't answer the question, they may ask it again. And maybe you don't want to admit that, well, yeah, I made a D in cell biology my junior year, and it was a tough class. It's better to answer it than to tap dance or evade it. You may not have to say what grade that you made, but if you say, yes, cell biology was a tough class for me, I struggled a bit, and here's what I did to at least try to get a decent grade, because the interviewer may want to ask a follow-up question about that, but you have to answer the question. And if they keep repeating the same question, that means they're really, really wanting to have a direct answer. So please don't avoid that. And what is unique about you, there may not be an aha, oh, we've never heard that before or anything like that, but just tell us about you. If you are Virgilio Gazoom, who graduated a few years ago, is a very talented musician, and he commented because he loves music and it was his stress. So he talked about how picking up the saxophone after a tough exam was a great outlet. Well, that's not everybody, but that was a unique and interesting example of Virgilio telling us what's unique about him.
Mr. Hauser, we have another question.
Sure.
So during the faculty interview, is this conversation based or MMI based? In other words, multiple mini interviews, or is it a combination of both?
No, it is a one-on-one. So you will have one interview with one faculty member. We've evaluated, all the various styles, and I just believe, and I have a bias here, so I will acknowledge I have a bias. When I was in grad school, I hated panel interviews, but we also feel by having a more in-depth one-on-one interview, it allows the faculty member to spend enough time to truly get to know more about you than spending maybe 10, 15 minutes. I mean, there are definitely advantages to different formats. So I'm not saying that ours is the absolute best, or it just seems like it works for us. So again, every one of our interviewers see patients in our clinic. And one of the things that we charge the interviewer is that one litmus test of if the interview goes well, can you see working with this student in a patient care setting? So sometimes we think having, roughly it takes on average about 45 minutes as an interview. And in that 45-minute time, if you were able to get to know the student well, that's a good indication of, if the interview went well. And we just think that having it one-on-one with one versus multiple is the best way to go. And that's how it is.
Thank you.
Okay, so steps after the interview, how to appropriately correspond after the interview, whether that be like verbally after it's done, an email or a note. There's not a tried or true perfect way, but always the faculty member is an optometrist, is a doctor, and we're not saying this in a haughty way, but it's always polite and good manners, at least initially, to address the faculty member as doctor versus, hi, I'm Dr. Bill Jones. Well, Bill, so I would always defer by starting by saying, well, Dr. Jones, I have a question for you. Or if you wanted to send a thank you email, address them as Dr. Jones versus Bill. Now, most of our faculty, once they get to know you, say, hey, call me Bill. But initially, it's always, I think, a deference and appropriate deference and respect by addressing the faculty member as doctor. You can write a thank you note or send an email. It's not required or whatnot, but I would just say if you're inclined to do so, they're always well received and they appreciate it. How to accept, delay, or decline an admissions offer. This time of year, we give applicants 8 weeks after acceptance to decide if you wish to submit a tuition deposit. But if you know day one, hey, I enjoyed my interview at STO, but I'm going to another school, by emailing us or calling and letting us know, that spot, or if you have a scholarship or a contract seat, can be offered to another student. So it's always, again, preferred or appreciated if a student knows that they're not coming, to go ahead and delay. If you're truly deciding, use the full time. That's why we give applicants 8 weeks this time of year, to say, hey, if I'm accepted to 2 or 3 schools, I want to mull things over and really decide. It's understandable. And then how to follow up on suggestions and next steps. If we ask an applicant to do something after an interview, let's say in the interview, the applicant has only really been exposed to one office and may have a somewhat limited view of optometry. And the admissions office suggests or requires, hey, John, Jane, we'd like for you to spend 2 days in an additional optometry office to see how other optometrists practice. If that applicant were to kind of complain, or dare I say whine, why are you making me do this? That's, maybe I'm old school, but that's a telltale for me. That maybe the student doesn't fully understand that there are so many different ways to practice optometry. Maybe they haven't done their homework, or if they're not willing to spend a little extra time to learn more about the field that they're going to do for 40 or 50 years, that might not be the kind of student. Or if we're asking a student to repeat a class because they made a D in it, or maybe they're retake the OAT because it wasn't very high. And I'll just say it again, not to come across cocky, but SEO standards are higher than many of our sister institutions. So if you make a 290 on the OAT and quite possibly a 300, we're going to ask you to retake it. And if you say, but this school or that school has already accepted me, well, I equate that to, if you apply to a junior college in Harvard, you can't tell Harvard, hey, well, Joe Community College has already accepted me. Why haven't you? Well, the standards are higher. So how a student responds to that can also, if a student says, you know what, I do acknowledge that my OAT wasn't very high, and I understand why you're making me retake it. Or, yes, I did make a D in physics. Maybe I do need to retake that class. How you respond can show a lot of maturity. We're not going to make you jump through a hoop just to jump through a hoop. If we're saying we really recommend you're doing something, we think it's for your own good, not just say, hey, let's make them do something they don't want to do. And some contact information here as far as for myself and Ms. Cates, and really, I don't want to speak for Ashley per se here, but many times if we get a question, we may not be the perfect person to answer, but we can get you in touch. Like if you want to talk to a current student or a faculty member or an alum, we can easily provide that for you. So with that, I'm happy to field. The questions so far have been great. I'm happy to field any others you guys may have.
Okay. So yes, this brings us to the end of our presentation, and I know that Mr. Hauser has shared a lot of information with you all today. So I hope that you have found it to be helpful for you as you begin or even continue the admissions process this year. Through the session, we may have addressed some of the inquiries or concerns that you had regarding interviewing, but if we did not, please take the time now to go ahead and write out your questions in the question box for us. And as Mr. Hauser said, you can feel free to contact us via email, which you see on the screen right now, with queries at any time. And I would also like to take a moment to plug our next session, We will be hosting a webinar on the SEO curriculum in September. This presentation will cover SEO's 4-year curriculum. So if you've ever wondered what your classes will be like or were curious about your clinical practices, you will not want to miss this webinar. So please keep your eyes open for the invitation to join us for the next SEO session in September. And also in the coming days, you will be able to see the link on our webpage where you see at the bottom seo.edu online information sessions, where you can register for the webinar and view our previous webinars too. And again, once this one has downloaded, the communications department will have this one available for showing too. And if you haven't already done so, I'm going to invite you to request more information. You can see the explore.sco.edu inquiry form link. By signing up, you will receive continual communication from SEO to further explore our unique program. And you're also going to have a personalized microsite created for you, as well as a personal advisor assigned. So with that, let me take a look at some of the questions that are coming in. And we have quite a few. Okay, so during the current or considering the current pandemic situation, how are students reliably expected to gather shadowing hours?
That is an excellent, excellent question. And of course, you know, obviously any experience that you had prior to March of this year or when the pandemic spread to your particular area, hopefully it helps some. Most optometry offices are back up and running to some extent, but we do recognize that shadowing experiences are more challenging for them. So therefore, there's only one way to get it is to ask. And if you are having trouble getting direct shadowing contact time, you can call and contact us for us to maybe give some recommendations of doctors in your area that might be more apt to have you come in and shadow. I will say when you are getting a shadowing opportunity to be very courteous, because needless to say, the doctor, the optometry offices are first and foremost trying to make sure that their patients and their staff and themselves are being safe and secure and healthy. So just being mindful of whatever expectations and hygiene and you know, make sure you're wearing your mask appropriately and stuff like that would be certainly well received by the optometrist that's giving you his or her time to shadow.
You've mentioned a few times that it is important to do your homework in order to prepare for the interview. Other than in-person shadowing and working, what are some useful resources that candidates could use to get reliable information on all areas of the optometric profession?
Yeah, I'll recommend like the American Optometric Association, AOA's website, national boards, National Board of Examiners in Optometry, because every optometrist, or to become a licensed optometrist, you not only have to graduate from an optometry school, but you have to pass at least 3 parts, depending upon the state that you're going back to, of national boards. So that would give you information of like what the national board exams are like. For the AOA, it would give information about advocacy and how they're trying to grow the profession by legislative actions, placement opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And then the school website, of course, as referenced before, is a wonderful site about the day in the life of a student and also what our doctors do. And then if you have the opportunity with your optometrist or an optometrist in your neighborhood, it's just simply talking to him or her about what are the challenges, what do you see are the changes coming up, what's the most rewarding or fulfilling part of your day or career. All these are excellent resources for you.
Mr. Hauser, what is an acceptable OAT score?
We work on a sliding scale. The lowest that we've accepted in a long time is a 300 academic average. But also, not all 300s are the same because a 300 comprises about 12, 13% of the test population. So if you have a 300 academic average, but a 280 in total science, that would probably be a weak 300. If you have a 300 and it's consistent and you have a very high GPA, that would be more acceptable. Usually, or often I should say, when a student has a 300 on the OET, we have a discussion to at least consider retaking, not always necessary. But even like if you have a 310 or a 320, what a concern can be sometimes are inconsistencies. So if you have a 320, but a 220 in physics or a 220 in chemistry or something like that, that can be more concerning to us than an applicant with a 310 but more consistent scores. But definitely without any hesitation, a 300 or higher is implicitly a requirement.
So speaking of OAT, can a candidate be asked to interview even if we know that there's going to be a need for the candidate to retake the OAT for a better score?
That's a good question. And here's usually, I never say never, but sometimes what will happen, and I'm going to paraphrase Mr. Robertson, our admissions director. Let's say a student took the OAT August 1st and made a 290. Everything else about their file is good. And they're retaking November 1st. And it's October 25th. Sometimes Mr. Robertson may go ahead and invite the the applicant for an interview, but stressing, we still need your OAT score retake, but let's go ahead and get the interview done so that it's less of a time bottleneck. So I hope I made myself clear there. We almost always require the OAT before an interview. I can't really think of one without, but if a retake is necessary, sometimes Mr. Robertson will allow the applicant to interview knowing that the retake is coming, but that should certainly not be misinterpreted as it has been before. Oh, if you're inviting me for an interview, then I don't need to retake the OAT. No, and he spells it out. He says, John, if we're inviting you, but we're still expecting you to retake that OAT in a few weeks.
Would you recommend that applicants take advantage of their university's mock interviews that are provided through their career centers? Or
Absolutely.
does CO Student Services offer mock interviews?
Definitely utilizing the services of your college or university because they've done it before and they can, or even just filming. It's amazing, both filming visually and audio. I think we all are surprised when we see ourselves or hear ourselves. I just said, oh, so like for example, if I'm being recorded right now and I go back and listen to it, and say, wow, I said a lot more than I thought I did. These are things that you can evaluate and try to work on or be aware of. I just think it's healthy to practice fielding questions that you don't know are coming. So if your college or university career center or office allows or provides mock interviews, I would definitely take advantage of it because it would practice makes perfect.
So what is a quality or a value that you rarely see in applicants, but you would love to see more of?
That is a wonderful question. Whoever asked that question just rose to the top of the applicant pool, in my opinion. That is a wonderful, insightful question. I think humility and self-awareness are very well received. It's very heartening to me when I talk with an applicant who's very accomplished, very skilled, very intelligent, but also very humble. Because I think humility in the healthcare field allows you to connect better with your patients and encourage you to continue to learn. Apathy doesn't set in. When you're saying, hey, yeah, I guess I'm kind of smart, but I really need to study harder and learn more to the benefit of my patients, is an incredibly humble perspective. Or, yes, I may have had good grades coming into optometry school, but I'm being taught by experienced optometrists, I'm going to entrust what they're telling me that it's for my own good, versus, again, why are we learning this? So I do think when intelligent, insightful humans can also impart humility or demonstrate that, that's a somewhat rare but always welcomed attribute.
Is the counseling with admissions considered in addition to the interview when making a decision? Or is it more so just to ensure that everything is prepared for the application and admittance?
Again, a very good question. It's not the formal interview, but it is a part of the process, because everyone that you're doing a counseling session with is on the interview committee. So I'll speak for her. Let's say you're having a counseling session with Ms. Cates, and you're a little standoffish or inappropriate or aloof, but you were fine with the interviewer. Does that mean that you were on for the interviewer, and you may have the kind of mentality, well, I'll play up when it's necessary, but otherwise I'm just going to be a, kind of my own person, or dare I say, maybe a little bit of an awkward or bad personality. So if Ms. Cates in her session says, hey, I know the interviewer thought the communications were great, but I had a real tough time getting the applicant to answer my questions, or he or she seemed aloof or apathetic or uncaring, that will get the committee's attention.
So, Mr. Hauser, how fast does the class fill up? For example, how much of the class is filled by the end of September?
We usually fill the class in March, because also remember, if we have 100 offers by, let's say, middle to the end of October, they're not all deposited. Out of that 100, we may get 60 or 70 deposits. So that's the real number that's critical. It usually takes about 200 to 225 offers to fill a class of 136.
So along the same lines, does an interview later in the process indicate a lesser chance of acceptance?
Most likely, yes, because with rolling admission, there's going to be fewer seats. It's not interpreted like if you're interviewing in December that you're not as smart or your numbers may not be as strong. It probably implies that you were just a little bit later to apply. And that could get the interviewer's attention. So why did John wait so late to apply? And sometimes it comes out, like if you applied in August, took the OAT, didn't do as well as you'd like, retook it in November, and that's why you have a December interview. That's very understandable and certainly not held against you. But that's just all information. I should say, the earlier you apply, the earlier you get the information in, definitely expedites the process. There's no doubt about it.
So we've had a couple of questions more specifically about shadowing. And this is really in regards to, do we encourage and accept informational interviews with optometrists?
Here's what I would say. If your local optometrist or optometrist in the area are not letting you shadow or work with them, an information session or discussion with them is certainly better than nothing. Ideally, we still would like for you to see firsthand the day in the life of an optometrist, but I want to answer this very carefully because we have never experienced this as far as our going through a pandemic. So I don't want to answer with across the board, black and white, this is how it is. Because also, if matters get worse in the coming months or weeks, this might be even more of an issue than it is now. So yes, we definitely want students to have shadowing experiences. If you can't get it, having information sessions or discussions with optometrists is certainly better than if, but engage us. Let us know, hey, we're having a tough time getting with an optometrist in the area. They're willing to talk with me or have a Teams meeting with me, but not to shadow me. I think that's one of those things where it warrants an individual call with one of us in the admissions office to kind of walk you through what are your best options.
Is a bachelor's degree necessary to be considered for an interview?
It's not required, but if you do not have a bachelor's degree when you're to enter optometry school, you're going to probably need to have stronger credentials. Simply because one of the things a bachelor's degree shows is your ability to complete something. If you started and you completed. Now, you can make the argument that if you're applying after 2 years of undergrad and you, by the time you're a third year versus fourth year in undergrad, you've completed all the prerequisites and can enter optometry school, that's commendable. That's incredibly impressive. But the one thing a bachelor's degree does show is that you were able to complete what you started, especially if you do it on time in 4 years or less. So there is a value to that, and that's why one of the reasons why having a bachelor's degree is required. If you're not planning to have a bachelor's degree, that's again one of those things where I think it warrants a call to the admissions office to share why. There's different reasons. So I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush that all students with a bachelor's degrees are better than those without. No, I'm not saying that. But the reasons why you're not getting a bachelor's degree might be germane too.
Okay, and we've had a couple of other questions about standardized tests. So is there a possibility that an applicant could be called for an interview before ever taking the standardized entrance exam or before completion of the prerequisites?
Well, before completing the prerequisites, yes, that happens quite a bit. You might be enrolled in microbiology in your last term. So we understand that. Again, I never say never, but it's very rare that we would invite an applicant for an interview without having their OAT or standardized test. I'm not saying it never happens or never would happen, but I know Mike Robertson, our admissions director who makes the decisions, really does not like inviting someone without the standardized test. So if we invite you for the interview and then you make a 220 on the OAT, that's, that's not a competitive applicant.
So this is a question about out-of-state. How do you best aim to recruit out-of-state candidates who are expected to pay a high out-of-state tuition their first year?
Well, first of all, we're not a public school, so we don't really have an in-state, out-of-state tuition. Our $38,200 is our regular tuition, which is actually one of the lower tuitions of all the optometry schools. We do have what's called regional or contract tuition with a select number of states. To answer that question best, if you're highly qualified, the vast majority of our scholarships are awarded to non-regional or using the terminology out of state because you're scheduled to pay the $38,000 tuition. So if you're from the state of Washington or Texas or Florida or Maine, Michigan, an out of state or non-regional state, and you have very strong credentials, that would be attractive in the scholarship review. But again, if you apply early, if you apply late, most of our scholarship funding is gone by then.
So Mr. Hauser, how does admissions compare the GPA of students who studied at elite institutions compared to those who are less selective or less rigorous?
Very good question, and I'll expand elite. We look at your major, your course loads. Again, if you're taking 18 hours versus 12, what's harder to maintain a competitive GPA? If you're a biochemistry major versus taking 4 PE classes in a semester, what's harder to maintain a challenging or competitive GPA? Also with the, so it is factored in. We do look at, and I'll use a little bit more instead of elite, like for example, especially junior college versus under university. If you have a 4.0 at a junior college, transfer to a 4-year degree college to get your degree, and you do okay, but your grades drop, you still have an okay overall GPA, but a low OET, that's a factor. But we always look at you know, here we are in Memphis. Rhodes College here in town is a very established, very highly respected local college, especially for liberal arts education. So if you graduate from Rhodes with a 3.8, that might be more impressive, especially if you're taking heavy loads. But if you graduate from Rhodes with a 3.2, only taking 12 hours a term, and you're not working or not involved, that's less impressive than the prior example. But everything is factored in. There's not a stone that's not unturned in the review.
Is it a must that a candidate needs to know the anatomy of an eye when going to their interviews?
No. Obviously, the more familiarity that you have, whether it be with the anatomy of the eye, the function, or just really more the function of an optometry office, I think is more germane. But no, you're not going to be quizzed. The faculty member is not going to point to a part of the eye and say, hey, what's this? It's not that. But certainly, doing your homework of some familiarity of basic components of the eye and visual system, especially when it comes to questions, I think would be helpful. But you're not going to have a quiz, you know, draw me an eye and let's map all the components or anything like that. They're not going to do that on an interview.
So is it frowned upon to bring up family members that were optometrists during the interview process?
You mean to reference if they have a family member?
Correct.
No, but here's where I think this will answer the question. If you're the son or daughter of an optometrist who's currently practicing, remember you have to have a letter of recommendation from a non-related optometrist. And we want you to physically shadow that office, not just mom and dad's. So I think it's perfectly appropriate, and you should. If you have a parent or an uncle or a cousin who's an optometrist, bring that up and talk about how he or she influenced you. But to really make an impression, couple that with, but I've also shadowed another local optometrist aside from my family members who practices down the road or whatnot. That demonstrates, again, your willingness to get additional exposure and experience.
So speaking of exposure, regarding shadowing or even work, is it okay if candidates do so with other healthcare professionals or ophthalmologists to ensure that they fit in the optometry count towards some of the shadowing hours or work hours?
Well, not necessarily just in, we always want optometry hours, but a commonly asked question is why optometry over other health professions? So if a student says, well, I did shadow a dentist, I shadowed a pharmacist, I shadowed an MD, that's actually well received. But we always want that to be counterbalanced with, but I also shadowed optometry. It's great to get experience with ophthalmology, especially in most ophthalmologist practice, you have optometrists in there too. But we still want you to have direct exposure with optometrists, not ophthalmologists at the exclusion of optometry. So if you've worked for or shadowed with an ophthalmologist, that's fantastic. but you still would need, in my humble opinion, to get some experience, exposure, or time with optometrist to make the kind of impression you want to make on the interview.
You have strongly suggested that candidates apply early. Would you define what early is, what that is considered to be?
Well, like for example, people who have applied now versus October is earlier than October. I would say if you have everything ready, submit it. If the reason for your delaying is because, well, I'm taking the OAT October 1st, you can go ahead and apply. And because remember, it takes about 2 weeks for Optomcast to process your application. And then we review it. And then when you take the OAT, you can have your scores emailed to us. They're unofficial, but we can use that to determine an invitation for an interview. That eliminates time bottlenecks. And that's what you really want to do with admissions. You don't want to, hey, I'm taking the OAT November 1st. You take the OAT November 1st and you do, oh, I'm going to apply now. And by the time you submit the application and it gets verified and validated, it might be late November and you've created a time bottleneck. Same scenario, you apply October 1st or September 1st, get everything done, and then you take the OAT out November 1st, everything's ready. We get a score, it's competitive, we can invite you for an interview that day. And it expedites the process immediately or significantly.
In regards to the Optomcast application, are candidates expected to note what classes they are planning to take in the fall and the spring under the transcript portion?
Typically the ensuing, not necessarily, you can enter it for the ensuing semesters. It's not like you have to follow it religiously. But more often than not, what we see, like for people who have applied to date, they would at least enter what they're taking in the fall. May or may not enter what they're taking in the spring. It's not a huge component, but when you do enter it, it gives us in the review that, okay, they're taking 15 hours in the fall, 15 hours in the spring. That should be enough to graduate. It just gives a little more reassurance with that. It's not an absolute, you have to do it, but it is well received.
And is a letter of recommendation from an optometrist required?
Yes. A non-related optometrist.
Okay. So given the pandemic,
and a faculty member in the sciences or your pre-optometry advisor.
So given the pandemic, would an interviewee be asked to do something to fulfill some sort of obligation after the COVID-19 clears up?
That's a very good question, and we have discussed that as an admissions committee. Again, when we were reviewing all of this in the spring and the summer, and Ashley, you probably remember, we were saying to ourselves, we don't know what it's going to be like in 3 months or 6 months, so it's all provisional. But yes, we have discussed what happens, especially if you're living in a hot spot and the area optometrists either are closed or not willing or able to allow you to come and shadow. So we're not thinking this is going to happen, or we're certainly hoping it's not going to happen, but we have at least discussed as a committee what happens if an applicant truly can't get shadowing, but otherwise is a very competitive applicant. We can place that as sort of as a stipulation that John and Jane, you've been accepted, but we do require that you get 10 to 15 hours of shadowing before orientation.
And is there a specific number of hours for shadowing that a candidate must complete?
Not specific, but generally 30 is a good benchmark. Now that's maybe a little bit less with COVID, maybe more like 20 if you've had trouble. But remember, you're competing with your peers. So if you only have 15 hours and the majority of the other applicants have 45, then I wasn't a math major, but 45 is higher than 15 every day of the week. So it is, generally speaking, over my time, 30 hours in 2 or 3 different practices is sort of an implicit benchmark, minimum benchmark to shoot for, as far as direct shadowing.
And if a candidate has already submitted an application, but they're waiting for a letter of recommendation, will you still look at and consider the application?
Absolutely. The only thing where it might be in question is if there isn't shadowing demonstrated on the application, we haven't received the optometrist letter of recommendation. That could be critical for us to review. Or if a student has had some academic struggles and we don't have the academic advisor's letter of recommendation, we might. But if you're a 4-point GPA student and we don't have your academic letter of recommendation, we'll speculate that that's probably going to be pretty favorable. So we can and have invited candidates for interviews without all their letters of recommendation, but keep in mind, we may not invite you depending upon the circumstance.
So speaking of letters of recommendation, in addition to the 2 that are required, would a supplemental letter be stronger from another optometrist or another science professor?
I'm going to answer without answering it. I would say someone who knows you. I'd rather get a letter from someone who knows you than we get a lot of letters from both optometrists and advisors that you can tell they don't know that student. I would much rather receive from somebody that knows you versus saying it's got to be either the advisor or the optometrist for additional letters.
What steps or actions has SCO, or in particular the admissions committee, taken to ensure greater diversity in incoming classes?
Well, we have established a direct position of Director of Diversity and Inclusion, and Dr. Dumas Pepper has she's been at the college for several years, but has certainly made strides with that. We recruit and strive to have diversity in every aspect of that word, not just ethnicity. In every aspect of that word, I'm a firm believer having a homogenous entering class or class is boring. Let's get students from different backgrounds, whether that be in past experiences, vocation, life experiences, academic experiences, socioeconomic. So yes, we do provide that, but the diversity and inclusion position hopefully illustrates that the SEO takes that very seriously.
If someone has already applied, but they're taking the OAT in October, how soon after that can they expect a possible invitation to interview?
Okay, the timeline again, can you share that they apply when?
Sure, they've already applied. They applied in July.
Okay.
And they're taking the exam in October.
Okay.
So approximately what is the turnaround time?
Well, if everything is competitive, because if you have a 2.7 versus a 3.7, that could be a key factor. But if everything is competitive and your file is complete, Mr. Robertson on countless occasions will get an OET score emailed to him and invite literally that minute if that's the only remaining component, especially, of course, if the OET score is competitive.
So before we had virtual interviews, were there any opportunities for prospective students to meet with current students so that they could ask the students questions and get their perspective?
Okay, one more time again, I'm sorry.
Sure. Before this cycle where we had virtual interviews, were there ever any opportunities for prospective students to meet with or talk to current students?
Oh, on the interview day?
I'm not sure if it's specific to the interview day.
Well, I think I can answer it both ways. Yes, if a student is interested in talking with a current student prior to interviewing, especially maybe for someone from your home state or alma mater, we're glad to attempt to do that. on the interview day, you do have interaction with students, but of course, under normal circumstances. And what we're doing this year is if a student is accepted, we're inviting you, you don't have to do it, but we're inviting you back to campus for an open house on Saturdays to give you a live tour with students and kind of have a Q&A session. It's only for accepted students because with social distancing, we're having to keep the numbers low. But that is something that we are doing.
And the last question. So will candidates be notified if they do not receive an invitation for an interview?
At the very end, it would be basically de facto by a denial letter. Because if someone applies right now and maybe they don't meet the minimum qualifications, but that can change. So if a student applies right now, let's say they have a low OAT score, that would not warrant an interview, but they retook it and improved, we could invite them at that time. So our philosophy is that we typically do not deny or reject applicants until the end of the cycle, because what if the applicant improves, whether it be with grades or OAT score or et cetera. So that's how one is notified. Now, if a student's curious, they can always contact us and say, hey, Mr. Hauser, Ms. Cates, Mr. Robertson, here are my numbers, here's my shadowing. What do you think is the likelihood of my being invited for an interview, or what would I need to do to enhance my chances? And we're happy to counsel. But we don't formally say, no, you're not getting an interview de facto until we start sending out denial letters.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hauser. I appreciate your sharing your time and your expertise today. And I want to thank everybody, all the attendees who connected with us today as well. And we hope that you're going to join us again, particularly in September, to learn more about the SEO curriculum. So please remember to contact us if you have any questions. Again, our email addresses are on the screen. And in the meantime, I hope you all stay well and have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.